Excellent. All right, so today we have Courtney Poullas. Thank you everyone for joining us tonight. So Courtney is a part-time English professor at Youngstown State University. She's also a professor at Eastern Gateway Community College and ETI Technical College of Niles. She has been teaching and tutoring English in higher education since 2006. She earned her degrees from Youngstown State. In addition to experience in higher education, Courtney also has vast experience in the nonprofit business industry. Most of Courtney's experience with the 501c3 business model stems from her creation of the Youngstown Marathon, which is Youngstown, Ohio's first and only 26.2-mile road race. She founded the nonprofit in 2016 and served as executive director and race director for 2 years. In 2017, Courtney was selected as one of 2 Women of the Year published in the Youngstown Vindicator. Her most recent volunteer efforts include her work as the bread fairy, bacon delivery at the start of COVID-19 pandemic, and as a mentor and tutor for students attending Youngstown Harding Elementary. So I'll turn this over to Courtney.
All right, thanks for having me. And I'm going to talk about nonprofit industry, mostly the 501c3 model. So let me share my screen here and start the presentation. Okay. All right. All right, so you already learned a little bit about me. This is a picture of me at the inaugural Youngstown Marathon. So as they introduced, I'm a teacher, and this is the nonprofit that I founded in 2016. The first race was in 2017, and it's still going strong. There were some issues this year with COVID, obviously putting people into large groups and having them run a road race would have been pretty dangerous, but they did do a virtual race this year. It's still in existence and it's still going. So I just want to talk about how I got into this industry. It's kind of a funny, kind of weird story. So I'm the founder of the nonprofit, but this was not my idea. I read an article in the newspaper, in the Vindicator in 2016, that Youngstown was getting a marathon. And I'm an avid runner. I'm a marathoner myself. So I was really excited and I wanted to volunteer. So I called the person who was then the race director who was putting the race on and signed up to volunteer. And I noticed that I was getting more and more work and responsibility as time went on. And this person decided that he wasn't going to put the race on anymore. He was going to go bankrupt in his businesses and we were going to cancel the race. And that's how I inherited the race. That was an LLC, which was a very poor business model that you'll find out why today. But it was originally an LLC, and I turned it into a nonprofit, and that's how I started gaining experience in the industry. All right, so a few things that I plan to discuss today. I'm just going to give a brief introduction to the nonprofit business model. As I said, I'll be focusing mostly on 501c3, which covers charitable organizations among a few other popular types of nonprofits that we're familiar with. Talking about the differences between a nonprofit and a for-profit business. Some of them you'll probably know already, but there are others that are a little surprising. A few challenges that women face in the industry. Believe it or not, the industry itself is made up of about 75% women, except for the leadership positions. Those are still mostly made up of men. So we'll talk about some of the challenges there. And then I've got some sort of cautionary tales and words of advice for you guys if you're thinking about starting your own nonprofit. So what is a nonprofit? This is a type of corporation that has been granted tax exemption status by the IRS. People use the terms nonprofit business and tax exempt business interchangeably, and that's usually fine. That's typically acceptable. There's a lot more than we think of, though. When people think of nonprofits, I think that they think charities, and that's one kind of nonprofit, but it goes from 501c1 all the way to 501c29. And there's some charitable organizations for everything, and nonprofits for everything. There's actually 501c21, which is the Black Lung Benefit Trust. So there's quite a list. If you ever go and look it up, there is quite a list beyond charitable organizations. Like I said, 1 through 29. So 501c3 is the most popular. That's what the Youngstown Marathon is. It's a 501c3 charitable organization. And other types of nonprofit corporations that fall under 501c3 include those that are religious, educational, charitable, as I said, scientific, literary, those that test for public safety, foster national or international amateur sports competitions, and that prevent cruelty to children and animal organizations. So you can see why the most popular type of nonprofit then is a 501c3. These are the people that are forming charities to do good for the community. So I feel like that's what most of us are most familiar with. So a couple myths versus facts that I want to go over, because these are things that I had thought of incorrectly when I first got into this type of business. So one of the popular myths is that nonprofit corporations can't make any money. And those of you on this call, I'm sure, understand that there's a difference between earning revenue and making a profit. Nonprofit corporations have to make money. They can't take everything they earn and donate it to wherever they want to donate it to. There are several nonprofits that are in actual brick and mortar buildings, and they have vehicles that people have to drive back and forth to perform their services. They've got utility bills. They've got a ton of stuff they've got to pay for. And there can be salaried employees. So nonprofit corporations definitely bring in money. It gets questionable when there's an excess left at the end, or if one of the board members or one of the employees has a salary that looks a little bit maybe too much compared to the amount that's being donated. So definitely can make money. It just depends on where it's allocated. Another myth is that nonprofit corporations are made up solely of volunteers. Board members are not volunteers. They are actual members of the board, and we'll talk about that as well. But there are a lot of volunteers in some cases. I know in a lot of charities, especially in mine, where we were putting on a road race, we had volunteers for just about everything. So there can be a lot of volunteers, but nonprofit corporations are made up of people who do this as their job. So not everyone in a nonprofit is a volunteer. A typical practice is that board members are not paid simply for being board members. They usually have to carry out some kind of other task. For example, I had a salary when I was running the nonprofit, but it was for my duties as the race director, not for running the 501c3. And that's how it was on my board. Everyone else that was getting paid had some other kind of job. And I was looking it up today just to be sure, but legally, you can pay your board members. It's just kind of a snaky, poor practice, like an unspoken rule that we don't really do in the not-for-profit industry, at least in a charitable organization. And one of the facts here, contributing to some nonprofits does not carry a personal tax deduction. So one of the benefits of donating to most nonprofits is that it's tax deductible for you. But there are some where that's not the case. Going back to that 501c21, the Black Lung Trusts, you'd have to double check, because not all donations to nonprofits carry some kind of taxable deduction. A couple more here. Another myth, the board of directors can be made up of anyone, even if the members are related. It doesn't matter how small of a town you live in, there has to be one person on your board who is not related to you. So when I started my nonprofit, it was just my husband and I when I started the Marathon Foundation, because as you saw, it kind of fell in my lap. And we'll talk about the mistake that I made taking donations before I had the nonprofit status. But when we filed to become a nonprofit with the IRS, you needed a president and vice presidents. It was my husband and I. But in the state of Ohio, at least, you have to have at least one additional board member to serve as your secretary and or treasurer. Those can be the same position. But you can't just have a board made up of your family. That's a conflict of interest. Another myth is that filing to become a nonprofit takes forever. It used to, but I think within the last 10 years, that's when the IRS began offering a streamlined review. So typically, when you used to incorporate as a nonprofit, you would fill out a gigantic 1023 form that was like a book. But now there's a little 1.5-page form that's a 1023 EZ. So that's a lot easier. And later on in this presentation, I'll talk about the differences in filings. But it's definitely not as hard or as tough as it used to be, as long as it falls under a certain category. I believe Religious organizations, they can't fill out this kind of form, but a charitable organization is usually able to fill out the 1023 easy. Very quick response time. I think we sent that application in around Christmas. It was right after, I believe it was right after the New Year. So right around the holiday. The IRS is backed up to begin with, even more so around the holiday, but we got a response that we were then incorporated as a nonprofit within 2 weeks. It came in the mail. So really easy, really quick response time, way better than it used to be. And a fact is that public charities make up the largest percentage of the nonprofit business. So there are quite a few, as we talked about. There's 29 different tax exempt statuses that a business could receive, but the 501c3 is what makes up the most out of all of those categories. Another myth is that paid positions can earn a percentage of all funds. So according to the IRS, this, along with accepting finder's fees, they consider that a conflict of interest. So salaries on a nonprofit board have to be voted on, and then that's the salary. It's a hard number each year. It can go up or down, but that's got to be decided at the annual meeting. Using a percentage, we'll say, let's say that a sponsorship director is going to get 10% of whatever money he or she brings in. That would be considered a conflict of interest. The IRS doesn't want you to run the nonprofit that way. So that's a no-go. And another myth here is because nonprofits accept donations, they bring in a ton of revenue. That's not true either. So I've got this graph here. It looks like it's a tad bit distorted, but 55%, this is from 2019, 55% of nonprofits are filing a 990N, which is the postcard. It's a very quick way to file at the end of the year. And this represents no expenses reported or up to $50,000. That's who can file that 990N postcard. So the rest up to $100,000. But these giant nonprofits only make up about, we'll say 3% or so. Looks like 1% earned 5 million to 10 million, 2% greater than 10 million. So, you know, getting into a nonprofit, especially a charitable organization like a 501c3, people are usually doing that because they want to make a difference. This wouldn't be the industry to get into if you want to make a ton of money. So yeah, just because nonprofits can ask for donations and donors and sponsorships doesn't mean that they're bringing in a ton of money. It really depends on the kind of organization that's being run. All right, so let's talk about some of the differences here, nonprofit versus for-profit, the leadership part of this. So something I like to tell people is that in a nonprofit, the public is your boss. And what I mean is you're kind of under scrutiny in the public eye when it comes to your bookkeeping and your record keeping and your board of directors. Definitely more so than if you're running a for-profit business. I mean, obviously good and honest business practices, everyone has to abide by those if they want to keep up their business and keep going. But in a nonprofit, you can get booted off the board if you do something that really puts the public up in arms. So the leadership is decided by the board. The board is kind of decided by the public because there's a vote on that. And that's different than what you would see in the for-profit industry. Obviously, publicly traded companies, there's some differentiation between private companies, but there's typically not a board of directors voting on who gets to be the CEO of a for-profit. Another point is that leadership positions are elected each year at the annual meeting, typically. You are required as a nonprofit to have at least one meeting per year where your board of directors meets and it's open to the public. And we'll talk about that and why that can be a good fundraising technique. But that's how the leadership positions are selected. Obviously, in a for-profit corporation, it's not the same. People move up the corporate ladder at a for-profit corporation by their experience, by their continued education, and it's just a little bit more of a typical process than what you would see in a nonprofit. So overall, I would say you kind of have to watch yourself a little bit more on a nonprofit because at an annual meeting, they can replace you. It doesn't happen very often, especially if you're continuing your duties and the board is happy with everyone's performance. But if something comes up, they can ultimately elect to move you off the board and put somebody else in your place. It would depend on how the bylaws are written, and we will talk about bylaws. All right, a little bit more on leadership. So leadership positions in a nonprofit corporation are created and decided upon by a board of directors, and that board includes a president, a vice president, and a secretary and treasurer. I know, at least in Ohio, that a secretary and treasurer can be the same person. So you've got to have 3 people. I suggest having 4 because it's a better system of checks and balances, especially if something would come up. The more people who have had eyes on something, the better. But you have to have those 3 leadership positions, and those are the 3 main ones that you'd see on a nonprofit board. In a for-profit business, the leadership positions are created by the owner of the company, the bosses of the company, upper-level management, and there's more of a typical application process. You know, a job is posted either internally or externally, and then you go from there. In a nonprofit, the board can vote to create a new position, the same way company leaders in a private company can decide to create a new position. But there's a lot more to go through, I think, in a nonprofit when it comes to finalizing that. So you've got to write it up, you've got to take it to the board of directors, it's got to be approved, you've got to have the salary set and ready to go so you can present that at whatever annual meeting. So there's a lot more, I think, work that goes into this. And a lot more hands involved in making those kinds of positions and choosing leadership positions than you'd see in a for-profit company or corporation. Okay, so a little bit about finances. An important note, the biggest difference, and you guys know this, is that nonprofit corporations receive tax-exempt status and they do not pay federal income tax, which is not the same if you are running a for-profit corporation or a for-profit business. There are ways that you can lose your tax-exempt status, and we'll talk about those, but I would say this is the biggest difference when it comes to the finances. All right, and donations. Nonprofits thrive on contributions from individuals and businesses. So what I mean by that is that when I was running my charitable organization, we had contributions from our title sponsors. At that time, our title sponsors were Chemical Bank and Mercy Health. And we sold race registrations and shirts and stuff like that. But it was a lot more donations for this type of business than it was goods and services like you would see in a for-profit business. Obviously, in a for-profit, you're selling a good, you're selling a product, you're selling a service. So it's a little bit different in that regard. There are nonprofits who, create goods and services that might be related to donating to a charity or something like that. But I really think, especially for charitable organizations, it thrives on donations and big donations from title sponsors. All right, so I want to make a few points about the requirements for forming a 501c3. Like I said, the requirements could be different for some of those other types of nonprofit businesses, but for a 501c3, here's what we've got. So when you are filing, you need to include your board of directors, which is the president, vice president, secretary, and treasurer. In Ohio, the secretary and treasurer can be the same person. You need bylaws as well. There are templates for these that you can find online. You can find stuff like this on Rocket Lawyer or LegalZoom. They're pretty standard, I think, especially for a charity. So some examples of what could be in your bylaws: purposes and legal powers, membership dues, if you're going to have people pay money, if you're in some kind of club or something like that, if you're running a club as part of this. You'll also have to make clear the board of directors members, so you'll have to explain who they are, what their title is, how many you plan to have. And that's another point I want to make. You have to have at least 3 positions. So you have to have the president, vice president, secretary, and treasurer. But you can have as many as you want. And I know one of the local nonprofit boards, the Youngstown Peace Race, I mean, they've got like 20 or 30 people on their board. So my suggestion as someone who's done this before is not to make the board too big, because you do have to have an annual meeting and attendance is taken, and everyone should be in attendance if possible, especially if you're only having 1 meeting a year, which is the requirement. But you can have as many positions as you want. So at the Youngstown Marathon, we had the typical president, vice president, secretary, and treasurer, but we also had a sponsorship director, and we also had a pacing coordinator. So we had a few extra positions based on how we function in our organization, which was putting on a road race. We had a volunteer director as well. So these are people who are all on the board. And like I said, they did get paid, but they got paid for their responsibilities and the work that they did on the day of the race. Because if anyone has ever put an event on like that, you know how much work goes into it. So they weren't paid for being on the board, but they were paid for their work that they put into the actual race part of this. And in other charitable organizations, You know, if you've got someone who's running social media, or you've got someone who's, you know, doing work outside of voting and being on the board, then they can be paid as well. Organizational committees, so the purpose, the title, the duties of any other, I guess, like subcommittees that would be part of your nonprofit organization. And then you've got to have at least one board meeting per year. You can have as many of you as you want. They're good to be open to the public. That's really important. And the best thing about that, especially if you are a charity, is that you can have a fundraiser out of that. So you can invite people to an annual meeting. For example, I know that United Way, and I believe Boys and Girls Club, they have their annual meeting, or they used to have it at least at the Lake Club. And there was a ticket fee for that. So members of the general public who wanted to attend the board meeting, they could buy a ticket. It was not cheap, but they could come and they could see what the organization was up to and how they spent their money and what their plans were for the future. So you can have the annual meeting, and you can also turn that into some kind of fundraising event. And I know that for some organizations, this becomes one of their biggest fundraising events of the year. So the annual meeting, that's the requirement, but you can have as many meetings as you have, as you want to, or as you have to, based on the kind of organization that you're running. So for the marathon, as far as board meetings, we used to have several leading up to the race, and those were all published on our website. We would publish the agenda, and then we would invite people to come if they wanted to hear what our plans were. And afterwards, we would publish the minutes. So really, being a nonprofit is about being as transparent as you can. It's really important to be transparent because the public is giving you their money to put this organization together and to make something happen in the community. So it's important to be as transparent as you possibly can. And that means letting people come to your meetings. All right, so let's talk about the filing requirements. This is another thing that I think has gotten easier over the years. So you will be filing the 990, 990EZ, or 990N forms, which is the return of organization exempt from income tax. So you're still explaining to the IRS, here's the money I received, and here's where it went. But in some cases, it's just a tiny little form. So the 990N is what they call a postcard, and I have a picture of it on the next slide. Very simple, very easy, something you can do yourself, even though I always suggest having a CPA who's experienced and knowledgeable in nonprofits do this kind of stuff for you. But if you're a brand new nonprofit and this is your first year and you made up to $50,000 or less than that, then this would be the form that you would file. And again, it's way easier than the giant 990. Now, the 990EZ is used for organizations that make over $50,000, but no more than $199,000. So this is a little bit more detailed, but not as quite as the regular 990, which is for organizations that make over $200,000. And you can be up to 3 years behind with these filings before you would lose your tax exempt status. So I don't recommend that, but if you have an off year, if you forget to file it, if something happens, the IRS typically doesn't revoke your status of tax exemption after missing one, or even missing two, or even missing three sometimes. You know, I think it really depends on how much money you're bringing in. But if you're filling out that 990N or 990EZ, it's really, really simple, especially the postcard. So this is what it looks like. There's very little to fill out here. So there's the calendar year. That's when it's ending. Business, your gross receipts are normally under $50,000 or less. You've got the information here, and if the IRS wants to audit it, it can. But this is it. Is a one-pager, very simple to fill out, and that's it. The 990EZ or the 990 and the 990EZ, I don't have pictures of, especially the 990, because that's pages and pages. But if you're a brand new nonprofit just starting out, this would be the form that you would fill out unless you made more than $50,000. And the first year, this is what I filled out. And then in the consecutive years, the CPA had me do the 990EZ because we made a little bit more than that. All right, so I want to talk about some of the challenges that women can face in the industry. And one of those is definitely, I have these slides backwards. One of those is definitely delegating tasks. I think it can be a little bit intimidating sometimes to like run this whole organization and make sure that you delegate tasks appropriately. But having done this already and being a person who likes to kind of take over stuff and do everything myself, That's impossible. You'll get really burnt out, especially if it's a charitable organization that puts on events. Event planning is a beast of its own. And then running the nonprofit and doing the meticulous bookkeeping and doing the social media and everything, that just will burn you out, especially with other responsibilities. So you can't do it on your own. The work will never end. So it's important to become comfortable with assigning tasks to board members and to volunteers. That will really make or break your organization. And then sometimes delegation can be intimidating as a woman. When I first started, my board was made up, when I stopped running the nonprofit, there were 8 men and 3 women on the board. But when I first started, I was the only woman. It was me, my husband, and 4 of the Second Soul employees and the owner of Second Soul. So it was just me, and they were very respectful, all of them. But I think it can be a little bit intimidating to delegate task and start running the show, especially when you're the only woman and you're in a leadership position. And that statistic, again, women do make up 75% of the nonprofit industry. So you're definitely going to find yourself surrounded by a lot more women in this industry maybe than others. But that statistic does not apply to the leadership positions. So the executive director positions, the CEO positions, those are still typically male. So I think, in that regard, men do a lot of the leadership when it comes to nonprofit business models, but I think more and more we're going to see women running them because women are more involved in the nonprofit industry, which we can see with that statistic. Let me go back one slide. So these are some tasks that I wish I would have delegated that I didn't. So I was answering all the emails, I was answering all the Facebook messages and doing all that because this was a road race. So we were going to get a lot of questions from people. I also faced a lot of issues with the local running club. They called me and told me that I was going to put Youngstown on the map as a failure. So as far as delegating tasks, I think I kind of thought I had limited options for a while because our local running club, they were not on board with this, which I still haven't figured out. They're on board with it now, but I never really figured out why that was. So I was dealing with the drama and I was answering all the emails and I was doing the social media marketing and the management and I was designing graphics and I was trying to come up with a budget, and I'm really not good at budgeting. So these are all things that I probably should have delegated to other people. The emails will be nonstop. The messages will be nonstop. So my suggestion is to hire a virtual assistant. Hire someone to run your Facebook page and your Instagram account. It doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be someone who has 15 years of experience doing that. Just have someone step in and take over some of this stuff. And if budgeting is not your strong point, because it definitely wasn't mine, have someone help you with a budget or hire someone to come in and allocate everything and make your budget for you, and you guys can go over a draft together. That got me into a little bit of embarrassment when I was in a title sponsorship meeting with Chemical Bank. I forgot to put the t-shirts on the budget. So delegate what you're not good at and delegate what is driving you crazy. I promise it'll be worth it. Some other challenges I think is just simple time management. And this isn't specific to women, but I think women maybe have a few more issues with this because we're doing so many other things. We're running the business, we're being a wife, we're being a mom, taking care of kids, taking care of a house, and it can get a little bit overwhelming. Handling meticulous bookkeeping, another one. You have to be able at any point to show someone what the books look like. Because like I said, the public is who is giving you your money. So the public can have access and they can ask you questions about where your money is going. So do you have to show them your books? I don't know that you necessarily have to, but to remain transparent and continue getting funding from the public, it's really good to be able to say, this is where everything is going. So that bookkeeping can be kind of meticulous. Get yourself an accountant. The best thing I did too was have my CPA's company handle the payroll because we were getting paid. So having someone take care of all that money stuff and then they're responsible for it and I review it was a much better system of checks and balances and much better than me trying to do it myself. And I consider owning a business like I would consider being a landlord sometimes. If something breaks, if something goes wrong, that's going to be on you. You're going to be the first person to get the call, and that can be kind of overwhelming, and that can make it difficult to manage your time. Our website was down at one point. Everyone's calling me. I don't know how to fix the website, but I'm the face of this business and this organization and this race, so I'm going to be the one that has to try to figure out how to fix things. So I definitely think as women with so much other stuff going on, even if you don't have kids and even if you're single, there's other stuff you want to do. There's other things you have to take care of. And I think that can be challenging in any industry, but especially this one where people can at any time knock on the door, ask you a question about bookkeeping, ask you a question about something else. So I'll tell you a little story about the biggest challenge that I had. This was my pregnancy announcement. So probably the most challenging time in my life is when I was pregnant during my first year as the race director. So I was pregnant in 2017. And I was like waddling around at 39 weeks pregnant during news broadcasts and going to these meetings. And it was crazy. So this is when I learned like, hey, I got to delegate these tasks and I got to ask my board to do more for me because I just can't handle all of this. And I put the race on with a newborn strapped to my chest in a baby carrier. So, you know, anything that you can ask for help with, that's one of the biggest lessons that I learned. And I think sometimes as women, we're hesitant to ask for help because we want to be able to do everything and we want to be able to fix everything. But this experience, going through a pregnancy and being the director of this race and being the director of the nonprofit, I really learned a lot about delegating and asking for help. And finally, I want to take a minute to talk about that mom guilt, because I think this is something else that I really struggled with and that women struggle with when they're running a business like this. Where should I spend my time? Am I not spending enough time on the business? Am I spending enough time with my kids, with my husband, with my partner? Is it okay if I'm serving takeout every night? And then it all comes down to, what should I do in this 15 minutes that I have to myself? Should I clean? Should I pick up the chips that the kids threw on the floor? Should I take a nap? Should I read a book? So I think, again, time management and just understanding that you can't do everything. But I know this mom guilt thing, this happens whether or not you run a business. But I feel more so when you're running a business. And it's just a catch-22 because you want to contribute. And that was something that I really wanted to do, was contribute to, you know, the household finances and stuff. But I also wanted to spread my time out as evenly as possible. So that was definitely a balancing act when I was running this business. A few other words of wisdom. Always, always, always vet companies and business owners before you take donations from them. And the reason is, especially in my case, if you're going to have someone's business name on a shirt or on a banner or on some kind of sign, it's super important that you vet who they are and what they're about. One of our very first sponsors was Breaking Point Recovery Center. So always make sure you know exactly who people are and that it's a reputable company and they have reputable business practices, because if that crashes and burns for them, people are going to look at you and they're going to wonder why you took that sponsorship. So always make sure you vet as much as you can. Try to lock sponsors into a 3 to 5 year contract as well. So this is for logistical and financial reasons. You can't plan your budget if you don't know that your title sponsors are coming back. So when I first started, we had 2 title sponsors and they each gave us, they donated $15,000. And we tried as much as we could to lock them into either a 3 or 5 year contract, because it becomes excessively expensive. And you have to take away from money that you could donate to these different organizations, which was the point of putting on the race, because you have to buy new signs and new posters and, you know, print new stuff and change all of the forms and you can't use anything that was left over because this logo is not the same. So do what you can to try to lock in your sponsors for 3 to 5 years. I think Mercy Health was who we had locked in for a deal like that at first. There are rules governing how and when nonprofit corporations, especially charities, can accept donations from politicians. So you've got to be very careful with this. When I was putting the race on, I think it was someone who was running for judge or running for Congress or running for something, and they wanted to purchase a mile marker. And our lawyer advised us against doing that, because having a mile marker that says so-and-so for judge or vote for this person goes against the rules put forth by the IRS about who you can accept money from. So I'm not sure why that is. And it can be tempting to want to accept donations from people who are running for office or who are in office, especially if it's a big dollar amount. But you would definitely want to check with someone that you know, a lawyer, even a CPA might know something about that before you take money from anyone who is running for office. A couple other points here. So making a budget is pretty tricky, especially if you're planning an event. I mean, you have to have everything right down to like napkins or bottles of water and all that kind of stuff. So again, this is something that you should delegate because it's really important. Before someone hands you a check for $20,000 to become your presenting partner or your title sponsor, they want to know exactly where their money is going to go. Well, what's it going to be used for? Is it going to be used for shirts? Is it going to be used for medals? Is it going to be used for some kind of programming for kids? Is it going to be used for something that has to do with taking care of animals? Is it going to be used to put a new roof on your building so that you can continue running these operations? So it's very important to make sure that you have all those numbers as correct as possible, even if they're estimates, that they're close estimates when you go into those meetings to ask for sponsorships. Like I said, I went into my very first sponsorship meeting with Chemical Bank in 2017. I think now they're TFC or TCF or something, but yeah, I forgot to put the t-shirts on the budget, which cost us almost $10,000. So it's really important to make sure that you've got everything together. Another point is to barter whenever you can. We accepted a lot of donations for items that we needed. I think it can be a little bit exhilarating to, at least for me, I love sales. It can be exhilarating to go in and ask for those dollar amounts, especially the big ones. But especially if you're running an event or if you're just getting started as a nonprofit, barter whenever you can. This is one of the best ways to get what you need kind of under the table. And you know, I just think the first year it's a little bit better than accepting all dollar amounts. So we took donations for bottles of water, for trucks to help go put things. We had to put a bunch of stuff out on the course. We had to put mile markers. We had to drop porta-johns out on the course. So I would say, you know, especially starting, if it makes you a little bit more comfortable than asking for money, it'd be a good idea to barter whenever you can, depending on what type of business you're running. It could be even just gift cards. John Eagle gave us some gift cards towards purchasing bottles of water and some of the food. Panera donated bananas for the finish line, and they donated coffee and bagels. So I think depending on the type of organization that you run, there's the potential to get what you need without having to ask for money. All right, so just a few tips if you're thinking of starting your own nonprofit. Don't be intimidated by the paperwork. If you haven't made any money yet and you're just starting out and this is an idea that you have, you will likely, especially if you're a charity, like I said, religious organizations and some other organizations cannot fill out the 1023 Easy, which is the page-long application for tax exempt status. But if you're new and you haven't made a ton of money yet, this is fine. And you can backdate as well. We had to backdate. And that was one story that I forgot to tell you guys, is that I accepted a $15,000 donation as an LLC. And there would have been a 30% tax burden with that. So you can backdate your form if you have to. But if you made little to no money and you're just starting, don't be intimidated. You're going to fill out a paper that's probably 1.5 pages. Have your board positions and other positions defined and ready to go. So when you are submitting your paperwork, have everything set, have your bylaws ready to go. Develop a strong mission statement so that you and your team are working toward the same goal. A mission statement can seem kind of corny, but at least people know a little bit more about what you're about. So one of the questions you can ask your potential board members is, how do you align with this mission? Does this align with your values and your beliefs? Do you feel that you can hold up the mission statement the way the rest of the board does? So I think, you know, having that little statement or few statements in place can help you build a team that is really on the same path to achieve the same goals, especially if it's a charity. And then make a budget so that you have an easier time deciding how to ask for donations and sponsorships. Going in and saying, I need $15,000 toward this race, versus going in and saying, I need $15,000 and I'm going to use it for A, B, C, D, and E. Those are two different statements, and one is a lot more specific. So the more specific you can be with numbers in your nonprofit, the better off you will be. And just a side note about sponsors for charitable organizations, if you can barter your way into getting a media sponsor, do it. We had WFMJ match us. I think we paid $1,000. they put in 1,000, and that took care of our media coverage. And that's almost a form of delegating as well. And then a presenting or title sponsor, that's a good way to get big dollars on the books. And finally, the biggest investment you can make when you get your first sponsorship check or your first few, whatever you're selling, whatever you're making money from, whenever you get those first few dollars, the best thing you can do is invest in a lawyer and in a CPA who have experience and knowledge in a nonprofit business. So like I said, I began the Youngstown Marathon Foundation. I had adopted and taken over this LLC that was from the person who was running the race before me or planned to run it. And that would have come with a very high tax burden that would have really cut into our scholarship or our sponsorship dollars. So having a CPA who knows nonprofits and having a lawyer who understands and can represent the nonprofit industry if necessary, those are two things that I think are the best investments you can make. So, all right, I think I talked enough here. So if anyone has questions, feel free.
Courtney, can you hear me? So for some reason I can't hear you, but
I was on mute, that's why.
oh, okay. Question I have is, how can you talk for a few minutes on how easy it is to find money, and if you had to set up an organization ideally that would allow you, rather than the president of the foundation, to look for money, would you hire an outside source to find money and money for you, or just talk a little bit about how you might structure that?
I think finding money depends on the type of organization that you have and how many other organizations are out there like that. I think part of the reason why I had an easy time, because I'll admit it wasn't that hard. Part of the reason that we had an easy time, and it was actually the bank that reached out to us, was because there was no marathon in the city yet. So I think finding the money, it depends on the type of organization that you're running and how many other organizations like that are in the area. And I would not suggest outsourcing anyone to get scholarships or to get sponsorships or donations. I would make it a board position or have someone on the board do it. And the reason is because we have heard typically there are people who do want a percentage. They want like a commission on the amount of money they can bring in, and that is considered a conflict of interest. So I would have somebody on the board dedicated to that, and then have a salary that you can pay them.
So maybe the board positions, as you structure this going forward, would include a marketing or funding person?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
okay.
we had a sponsorship director. I worked with the title sponsorships, so I kind of like managed the larger ones, but for the mile markers and for like little donations and bartering and stuff like that, we had a board position called sponsorship director.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of work. I mean, any of you that have do sales based on commission, it's a lot of tiring work. And I just don't know if people aren't really aligned with the mission of the nonprofit and they don't want to be part of the board. I think it's like they'll be kind of overworked. It's kind of tricky.
Understood.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else?
Hi, Courtney. This is Susan McConnell.
Hi.
Hi. Talk with us a little bit about grant writing.
That I'm not real experienced with it. I'll be honest. I mean, I haven't done formal grant writing. I've written letters to title sponsors in the past asking for sponsorships, but I don't have a ton of experience with grant writing.
So grants are for nonprofits, right? I mean, we can use them if we can find them. Is that correct?
Mhm.
So how would we, that is one thing that I was advised to take grant writing when I was in social work classes, but I didn't have time. I was raising children and, running a business and doing things. And I thought, oh, I'm never going to need that. And now that I've been thinking about a nonprofit, what do you suggest there? I mean, a course, or maybe find a grant writer, or?
I would suggest finding a grant writer, and then if you are well versed in writing and you follow the directions well, they do. I mean, if it's a formal grant, there's an application that you can write the grant yourself and then have someone look over it. But yeah, I mean, if you're applying for grants, I would definitely hire a grant writer to write it or to at least edit it for you.
Okay.
Yeah,
now,
and I know that there's a lot, like, I think, I can't remember the name of the organization. There's an organization around here that gives a lot of $5,000, $2,500 grants out to different community organizations.
Mm-hmm. Are you available for consultation after this presentation?
Yeah.
Okay. I love SCORE. 10 years ago, they helped me start my business, and we've been successful. And it is a S Corp, but I've always been interested in, doing something with a nonprofit as well. So we're tossing that around.
Awesome. Yeah. I would love to hear more about that sometime. Yeah.
Okay. And how do we connect with you?
I don't
SCORE?
You can email me. I can type it in the chat.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, great.
Courtney, one other comment, and was it Susan?
Yes.
Okay, one other comment that I think is pretty interesting in this is that as we were looking at some opportunities with SCORE, and we were looking at the potential of getting grants, there are specialists out there who do nothing but write grants.
Yeah.
So if you go to, like, one of the things that was highly recommended to me is there was a lady, and I don't have her name and I don't remember it right now, but she actually worked for Stambaugh Auditorium, and Stambaugh wrote a lot of grants to get activities for special programs for special needs students and those type of things that they put on. So there are people out there who will work on a contract basis, Susan, to help you do this. So just an FYI.
Okay. And Courtney, I didn't catch your whole email address. Courtney, POULISS.com. No.
POULLAS.
POULLAS. And then where was it again? At Gmail. Okay.
Yeah. So, when I wrote to our title sponsors, I had a form letter, not to title sponsors, but some of the smaller sponsorships. I had a form letter that I would send out through something like constant contact or something like that. So I would send out like an initial letter that there was sponsorships available. I would see who read the emails, and then I would send follow-ups. But when it came to asking for title sponsors, I would just pick up the phone and call them. Like, I would find someone that had, who I could talk to, the right person, and I would just pick up the phone and I would call them. And I would call them multiple times until I got to talk to someone. So it may have been a little bit incessant, but I preferred that method over the letter writing. But again, applying for a formal grant, then yes, you would want to follow the instructions and write to the prompt, whatever it might be.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Anybody else?
Courtney, doesn't sound like we have any other questions, but however, I do want to say that this was very, very informative.
Thank you.
And very well done. I think this was a very interesting discussion on the spin on a not-for-profit. And a lot of us that are in the for-profit area and have spent our whole lives in that don't really think about the intricacies and don't really think as well about the struggles of a female entrepreneur in that particular business. So I want to thank you for sharing that, because I thought it was first of all very well thought out, and secondly very well done.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I appreciate the opportunity to give you guys some more information about this. So
yeah, thank you, Courtney. I didn't realize how much was involved with 990s and 990 easy.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Wow.
So my email address is courtneypoullas@gmail.com. It's in the chat. If any of you ever have any questions or you want to talk nonprofits, just shoot me an email.
Thank you very much.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Thank you, Courtney. Good night.
Bye.
Take care.